Hey, CJN podcast listeners, Michael Fraiman here, executive producer. I wanted to share that the CJN has earned 6 Simon Rockhour Awards this month, the Jewish Pulitzers, as some folks call them. We took home awards for magazine writing and design, and for feature stories on a Holocaust music project, BDS on Canadian campuses, and 4 women who discovered they were sisters in their golden years, thanks to 23andMe. But we can't create award-winning journalism without your help. If you value independent Jewish journalism, please consider supporting us today at thecjn.ca/donate.
There's just certain anti-Semitic tropes that are carried over into vampire stuff. Basically, as I was reading a lot of vampire stuff during my master's, I was like, well, a lot of this matches up with like The Merchant of Venice, you know?
Hi, this is Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. So, as you may or may not know, in addition to being opinion editor of the CJN, I'm the author of a new book. It's called The Last Straight Woman. It's a feminist reclamation of female heterosexuality at a moment when this identity is at a strange sort of crossroads. Basically, since Trump's first election and the MeToo movement, there's been a lot of talk about how women either should go off men or are doing so. I argue that most women, in fact, are straight, very radical thought, and that a more productive feminist approach involves reframing women as subjects, basically, rather than as objects, and looking at straight womanhood as what I think it's essentially about, namely women desiring men. I do so using the extremely academic and sophisticated formula of I watched a lot of old sitcoms, British, American, and otherwise, and wrote about what female desire looks like on screen. So that's a lot of the book is that. Not all of it, but that comes up, as do more recent memoirs, different sources. It's a little bit all over the place source-wise because I just wanted to kind of go with whatever illustrated the points. But I am not a gender theorist. I arrived at these topics late, relatively speaking, and outside of any formal academic training. So even though I have a PhD in French, it's not in gender studies, nothing like that. So nothing like that, but not about straight womanhood exactly, even though my dissertation, now that I think about it, was about intermarriage. So kind of, sort of. But a part of me, when I wrote this book, was living in fear of what was going to happen when somebody who actually knew what they were talking about would read it. Because I thought, okay, there are people who know a lot about feminism without even having to think about it, who know instantaneously which thinkers are associated with which waves. And I thought, okay, somebody's going to read this and they're going to be like, it's just going to be a great big gotcha about everything that how did I not know who this one was, that one? And, I knew who a lot of them were, but, I was worried there would be some extremely important thing I missed and I'd be very embarrassed, a la Naomi Wolf when she went on BBC, I think it was Radio Live, and learned that her book made no sense. So it's a little bit worried, a little apprehensive. But then I was relieved and a bit stunned to read a review with footnotes and everything from someone far better versed in feminist thinkers and theory than I am, a PhD candidate I had met, as one does on the internet only, and she's Jewish. Hey, amazing. A Hebrew school teacher even, with lots of interesting stuff on Jewish matters as well. Virginia Karnstein of the Overlong Memories Substack, welcome to The Jewish Angle.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So first, I'd like you to tell us a bit about yourself, starting with your real name is not Virginia Karnstein, as I understand it. This is a pseudonym. Why that pseudonym? And just introduce yourself generally.
Yeah, so my actual name is Virginia Weaver. The Karnstein nickname, it's the name of a famous vampire character. And I study vampire stuff a lot, so it just made sense. It does also sound vaguely Jewish, which I didn't actually think about. But it is not an actual last name that anybody has. So it's for those who've read the novel Carmilla, they get it. Otherwise, it sounds fairly natural, even though it's a pseudonym. But it does also keep certain aspects of my internet presence separate.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So when you say you study vampires, is that what your dissertation is on?
No, my dissertation is on early modern antisemitism. So like Renaissance England, anti-Semitic literature, which is a very cheerful topic, obviously. But vampires are a sort of secondary topic that I do mostly in like public humanities work.
I was wondering if there's any overlap, though. Like, are you guys sort of...
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, vampire studies is actually how I got into studying anti-Semitism. So there's just certain anti-Semitic tropes that are carried over into vampire stuff, basically. As I was reading a lot of vampire stuff during my master's, I was like, well, a lot of this matches up with like The Merchant of Venice, you know?
So I'm wondering, I know from reading what you wrote, but others might not. Where does The Last Straight Woman fit within feminism? Is it part of a wave? Am I my own wave? Is it a wave that's, crashing down? What's going on?
So I frame it basically as being a continuation of second wave topics. So for those who might not be familiar with the different waves, the first wave was 19th to early 20th century. This second wave about 1963 to 1990. And then the third wave, 1990 to some would say the early 2010s when there's a fourth wave. I think we're still in the third wave. But the second wave is, I think, resurgent in a lot of ways. The topics, the works, people are reading stuff that's from the 1970s afresh and finding a lot new in it. And I found that The Last Straight Woman had a lot more to do with second wave texts and ideas than the third wave, which seems to be increasingly irrelevant.
So so the third wave would be like what was the third wave looking, or was the third wave looking to accomplish?
Yeah, so the third wave had a lot to do with culture, language. What even is gender is a topic that came up in the third wave. So the publication of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble kind of initiates the third wave in my mind. And so it became unclear what even was a woman. And language plays a big role in this, how language forms gender. But then in the more popular culture sense, it's about getting women into higher business positions, and less debate about like the ethics of prostitution and more to do with I would say like empowerment slogans on the one hand, and then linguistic structuralist highly academic stuff on the other hand.
Because I always think of those as being very separate, but I guess they were happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I tried to do, and I hope it worked, was I just did not want this to be a book about gender the way it's discussed lately, in the sense of this was not going to be me weighing in on what is a woman, me, writing 300 pages about trans topics that I don't have the passion to write about that like so many other people do. And I feel like it's well covered enough. I don't think this is my area. This is not what I'm writing about. I did see it as in conversation with that sort of Dworkin type, the sort of old school sex negativity, but also, and I don't know where this fits wives, but like what I call gender neutral sex positivity, right? Like this idea that I remember seeing in the 90s, early 2000s, that like anything that's sex positive is good, that you don't really distinguish between men and women in this front, that all that matters is consenting adults, that the only people who have bad things to say about the hookup culture are conservatives. And then you get MeToo comes around, that's basically like, wait a second, there are differences between men and women. You get this sort of sex negative pushback that comes from the left and the right in different ways. So that's kind of, but I hadn't been thinking about it though in terms of these waves at all in that way.
Yeah, I would say Me Too struck me as a bit of a second wave revival, honestly. And so I think anything responding to it has to be launched back into those debates. I mean, I think the Me Too moment was relatively short as like other identities started to creep in as maybe even more significant than gender in these discussions. But I think the Me Too, the very like broaching of that topic, that just like it took what woman is for granted, that felt very second wave for me. And so I think like responses to it often also give that second wavy vibe. Where the sex neutral, sex positive thing comes in, that was a big fight in the second wave. You're probably familiar with like the sex wars.
Less familiar than you are, but yes,
Okay.
It does come
Yeah.
up. Yes. And
Yeah.
One of the writers I quote, actually, a writer I learned about from my work at the CJN. I reviewed the book Bad Sex by Noah Willis Aronowitz, and it's actually her late mother, Ellen Willis, right?
Mhm.
Was one of the sex positive side
Yeah.
on this, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it definitely started during the second wave. The more radical feminist side viewed sex positive feminism as just a patriarchal trick to get to give women fewer excuses to not sleep with men, essentially. Um, but yeah, those would probably be like the essential characteristics. But I do agree that Me Too has a bit more of a second wave edge to it.
So what I'm trying to figure out is about all these kind of backlashes. Like, I guess my overview is maybe a little different from the more academic one, because what I see has happened is I identified something in this book that I finished writing, I guess in 2025, mostly wrote, I guess, in 2024. And when I was writing, this is something that like a project I'd started even several years prior to that. It was very unchic to be a straight woman
Mm-hmm.
in the circles to which this applies. Like, obviously in a, religious fundamentalist community, it's not going to be unchic to be a straight woman. It will be a real problem for a woman who isn't straight. Plenty of restrictions within heterosexuality as well in such environments. But basically, I was talking about this environment where it's not, it's seen as both unfashionable and bad politics to be a woman who's too interested in men, certainly who wants to get married, all of this. Then, whether you call it a vibe shift, whatever, things got a lot more socially conservative. You get the tradwives, it's a whole different scene. And my book is coming out into this world. And you don't choose exactly when a book appears, and there's always this lag. And from the title, it can kind of look like it is part of what I see as a backlash to all of that isn't the thing I'm trying to do. And that I'm finding this very frustrating, that like, I'm not saying it's great to be straight and men are the best. I'm saying most women are straight, and that's what feminism needs to have as a starting point, which is different from saying screw feminism, which seems to be more where I see the backlash. Does any of this resonate? Am I imagining things? You're on Substack, right? You see the gender slop. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yeah. No, it definitely resonates, and I can imagine the difficulty of sort of differentiating it from tradwifey stuff. I thought you made it pretty clear in the book that that's not what it is. But for people who only read titles and look at covers, you know, there's no accounting for them, I think. But yeah, I don't know. It is a sort of different cultural climate pretty quickly. However, I think that the people who um, there's a lot of criticism of the tradwives, basically. I see the right wing and the left wing side of things on my algorithms, and I think that I see way more criticism of tradwives or mockery than like love and affection, So I think that they've achieved a kind of prominence. Whether they've achieved actual like influence, a little less clear to me.
They have a lot of followers. Like, certainly the Ballerina Farm has tons and tons of followers and a big business built on this, but of course they don't all, right?
Yeah.
So separatism. What is separatism? Because I hadn't really thought about it in that way. But what is it, and where did it come from? The idea of women going their own way, I suppose.
Yeah. So it basically emerged in the second wave. Well, there were hints of it in the first wave, but it really emerged in the second wave as this idea that to be serious, feminists need to separate themselves from men. They need to direct their energy toward other women, ideally, if they can, their sexuality, but if they need to be chaste, that's also fine. But it was this, yeah, the gist of separatism is that women do need to go their own way. And I think we still see some hints of that, less extremely. But during the second wave, there was really an idea that, like, you should be, if you're heterosexual, you should at least be chaste, if not try the other team, you know? um, and that, yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And it was really, really dominant to the point where historians say that, like, yeah, during the second wave, everybody on the radical team was somewhat separatist.
So something that I'm trying to figure out, because I found glimmers of this in my own research, but I didn't do like an academic research type project on this. Were people at the time making the points that I make in terms of, were people pointing out that you kind of horseshoe yourself back into social conservatism the minute you say to a straight woman, be chaste? How is that ultimately that different from saying that to women from a conservative, socially conservative perspective? So that's one point I wonder about. And yeah, just sort of generally, like, the idea that sort of horseshoe idea, did that come up? And also, I guess this is even more specific, but I think that if you want to have a feminist household arrangement where that a woman's involved in, and there's nobody in the couple who's a woman is doing stereotypically female tasks, that's only really possible where there's a man and a woman. Like, if you want to have, like, if all the sort of, picking up of dirty laundry is going to somebody who isn't a woman, that's really only possible if it's the man in a straight relationship, right? So it just seems like there are a couple of different sort of logical things that occur to me when I think about this. And I don't mean this in a spirit of, and that's why all women should find a man and have him do their laundry. I'm saying this in a spirit of, like, that which is possible in the world. It just seems like there are a lot of kind of counter arguments. What was up in the way of counter arguments at the time? Or was it just such a different time? Like, were these, am I just repeating things people were already saying in 1978 without knowing it? Or were they not saying these things in 1978?
So I wouldn't say they were saying precisely the same things. Radical feminists did catch some flack for being conservative. But that was primarily in the debate over pornography. So they allied with the Christian right to try to get pornography banned. As far as, like, you're coming from a feminist perspective, definitely I would say countering other feminists. And so within the feminist circles, there were critiques, especially in the 80s, of, like, separatists. Every time a separatist, like, caves, it makes them look less serious, So there were critiques of just, like, the viability of it, which I think is at least somewhat in line with how you talk about it. Just, like, lack of realism comes up as a critique, as well as the fact that, like, it's fairly individualistic in the sense of, are you really doing feminism if your whole thing is that you're not with a man?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's different now from then is this is a society where women can be independent in a way that was not so possible in the 70s even. Things have changed. And I could see that if you just wanted to kind of extricate yourself from the thing where you need a man to, like, open a bank account and all of this, that there would be an appeal to separatism that I think you can kind of pare that down. And that's something that interests me. And part of why I wrote this book is just thinking about, like, yet women are still straight. Not all, but most. And how do you explain it if it's no longer that there's this obligation, all these social structures? And what I have found frustrating is this kind of persistence, even now, of talking about straight womanhood as a thing that's imposed. And I get how this came to be, because just the very idea to just separate out, like, any sort of identity in this way comes out of something like gender studies. So to even say straight women rather than just to say women where it's implied that these people are straight, right? Like, I get how it came to be, but there does just seem to be this piece missing. Like in a lot of the theory that I did read, it seemed to be kind of like, well, I gave up men. Why can't other women, coming from women who always were attracted to women? And that was pretty clear. So I don't know. That's something that I've found kind of frustrating. But I want to talk about femcels because I am confused about what a femcel is. So I talk about a category called frumpy but horny, which is just like how I describe certain sitcom characters. Is that a femcel? What's a femcel?
So I think that there's a couple of ways that one can define it, which is probably where anyone's confusion with it will come from. There is the true femcel, spelled without an E on the true. So it's just true femcel, one word, TRU, whatever. And these are women who simply can't get laid, or they think that they can't have. Usually they're more looking for romance than just purely sex. But just like an incel in the basic sense, they're women who can't find a dude or a woman. I did have an acquaintance once who said being a lesbian is synonymous with being a femcel just because she couldn't find a woman to be with. But that's not quite true. She was just joking. But yeah, so in the truest basic sense, a femcel is a woman who doesn't get laid. However, there is this sort of subcultural thing where a femcel is just sort of like into girly but edgy aesthetics and stuff like that. It's what I tend to call a post-femcel, or some scholars call it femcel core. But in the truest sense, I would say some of the frumpy but horny would be femcel, just not in the sense that they would be like online complaining about it. Like they probably wouldn't identify themselves as a femcel, but if you're just taking it as they can't get a man, technically, they could be a femcel.
It's just, it seems like such a kind of overlooked category because I think what MeToo did, which I think is so interesting and kind of under discussed, is it changed things from the stereotype of a feminist being the unattractive woman who can't get a man to being the super attractive woman who, when she steps out of the house, is just thronged with male attention. Some of it scary, maybe some of it not scary, but just so much male attention all the time. And so like Emily Ratajkowski was like the supermodel, was kind of the face of feminism, which was both kind of nice for feminism because what a pretty face, but also, it kind of erased that whole category of experience. And whenever I see people writing about femcel or something online, you get a lot of men saying, but that's not a thing because every woman has men chasing after her. Every woman, if she goes online, there's just men for every woman. And I think I can't speak to the online piece because I'm old and have been married for 1,000 years, but people are still people, and there are going to be women who just are not finding men. The fact that there might be some man somewhere who would spend a few moments with them does not necessarily change things, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, so I actually did like a fairly deep dive on true femcels a long time ago. I lurked for probably several years in like the main subreddit for them that eventually got banned. And yeah, I mean they're very dissatisfied, and it does seem like they would often get complaints from especially sort of far right men that like, oh, any woman can get laid if she wants to, and it's that was deeply frustrating to the true femcels. It's difficult. People aren't really great judges of their own attractiveness, for instance. So maybe some of these true femcels were not really involuntarily celibate, but it's really hard to tell. And then, yeah, people deny the existence of the category or make it into just an aesthetic, the sort of post-femcels. But yeah, if you ever go on their forums, they definitely feel that they are femcels.
Well, I'm curious about the forums. I'll dive in a forum every so often, but I wanted to ask you one kind of like completely off topic thing though, just to round things out, because it's like, I was just so interested in something you posted. So I wrote about the whole anti-Semitism studies and Jewish studies debacle, such as it is, where basically there are a lot of new academic programs that are anti-Semitism studies programs, where you can even sometimes get a degree in anti-Semitism studies. Sometimes it's just a center, sometimes it's a degree program. And the concern is that this could be maybe taking the place of Jewish studies, which is, a different thing. It's actually studying Jews, including anti-Semitism as part of it. But anyway, I had made a kind of offhand remark in my column about how you wouldn't really need anti-Semitism studies to study like Jewish texts, and that this wouldn't really be related. And you had some pushback that I appreciated and that I would like you to expand upon, because I thought it was interesting, and I'm always ready to hear some interesting feedback. So
yeah,
go for it.
So I think that, and this is the case now, but for centuries, a decent amount of anti-Semitism has been centered around Jewish texts. So there's anti-Talmudic anti-Semitism a lot. It's like, oh, have you seen what the Talmud says? And it's like, sometimes you see it and it's like, it's in chapter 9, verse 9. And you're like, what does that even mean? That's not how Talmud is organized. But yeah, I think that there does need to be a decent amount of Torah study to be able to wrap one's head around where anti-Semites are wrong. Where I did agree was that you're not necessarily you're not doing original readings. You're just trying to get the basic understanding of what the text actually says. But I do, in my own studies of anti-Semitism, Jewish texts do come up a lot, even back in like 17th century stuff.
I just think this is interesting because I was in a French department also studying to some extent anti-Semitism, and it almost did seem like a more natural fit outside of Jewish studies, just because it is the study of what people think about Jews. And the realities, yes, obviously that's important, and how anti-Semitism impacts actual Jews is important. But I almost thought that like sometimes Jewish studies itself would have kind of a blind spot around anti-Semitism, precisely because the focus was always just so much on Jews, and sometimes people in it didn't have very extensive experience with kind of the non-Jewish world, including the very anti-Semitic parts of it. I think that's changed, though. I think with online anti-Semitism, I don't think there's really any avoiding it. I don't think there's that kind of, unfortunately, I don't think people have the luxury of having that blind spot anymore. But I don't. Do you think so? Maybe we could wrap it up with this. I was just wondering, where do you think that there should be anti-Semitism studies as its own discipline?
So I don't think there should be anti-Semitism studies as a discipline, because it would actually be kind of an abnormality, in the sense of, like, I've definitely engaged in women's studies, women's gender and sexuality studies. And that's not, people often put that as like oppression studies, but it's also a study of women's literature, LGBT literature, right? So it's essentially the women's version of Jewish studies, if that makes sense. And so there's not really, there would be no equivalent to anti-Semitism studies. That would be an innovation that I don't think would be particularly useful.
Yeah. I mean, I can only agree. And I think it has this kind of way of reifying the idea. Like, to me, it just kind of plants the idea of like, there's this one group that's the hated people, and we're going to study how hated they are. And I don't know. I don't really want to like raise Jewish children in the world of that. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's something to know about. It's an important topic. It's not one that should be ignored, but like having a center that's that, and not having any equivalent center of any other groups being hated seems, I don't know. It's tricky, right? Like, it's like all of these questions, having a ton of guards in front of a synagogue is necessary so the synagogue's not physically attacked, even if it is, reifying the idea that a synagogue is a place someone might attack, whereas when it's an academic thing. Anyway, yeah, so I think it's tricky, but yes, I think we are on the same page. And I so appreciate all of your knowledge and that you have shared your knowledge, and I hope we continue chatting about all this stuff.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle.
Thank you for having me.